Welcome. My name's Dave Langham. I'm the Deputy Chief Judge of Compensation Claims in the state of Florida, and the topic today is the history of the United States judicial ethics efforts. It's a long story. The story is intertwined with the historical figures of prominence, which include the 27th President of the United States, William Howard Taft. He served from 1908 to 1912 and later became Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. President Justice Taft is unique in our American history in that he is the only individual to have served in both of those very critical government roles. Another of the figures in our story today is Kennesaw Mountain Landis. It has been said by historians that there is a benefit to having a strong name, and perhaps no reference is more apt than naming your son after a mountain. Kennesaw Mountain Landis' father was engaged in the Civil War and found himself at some point in the shadow of Kennesaw Mountain, an actual place. And when he returned home and a son was born, he and his wife decided that the appropriate strong name for their son would be Kennesaw Mountain. Now, Kennesaw Mountain was an interesting figure. It is his engaging and involving in both the federal practice as a judge and his involvement in baseball that leads us down the path to a code of judicial conduct that we're familiar with today. He's also been controversial recently because he was involved in founding and enabling the process by which the most valuable player in baseball is selected each year through balloting by sports writers. And because of his involvement in that evolution and the involvement of the sports writers, the most valuable player award is actually named the Kennesaw Mountain Landis Memorial Baseball Award. And so whoever the MVP is each year receives a recognition that includes Kennesaw Mountain's name and likeness. A great deal has been written and said recently in 2020 regarding the appropriateness of Kennesaw Mountain's name being on this award, or in fact, from some perspectives, his being recognized as part of American baseball in any context. The plaque is criticized because Kennesaw Mountain was involved in what has been referred to as a gentleman's agreement to keep blacks from playing the game of American baseball. And so he has been viewed historically as racist or as discriminatory, and his image is not one which many people believe is appropriate to attach to what's been called the great American pastime of baseball. And so some think that this award should be renamed, and there have actually been some proposals for specific names of other individuals that they think should replace him on this. It is a tragic piece of American history that we've seen discrimination. We continue to see discrimination today in various aspects and various involvements in our society. And so there are those who think that for that reason he should be divorced from this award. So in the saga that leads to our concept of Code of Judicial Conduct, we have the President of the United States, who later becomes a Supreme Court Justice, a federal judge, and a baseball player by the name of Shoeless Joe Jackson. Joseph Jefferson Jackson, many of you will be familiar with him. He is an iconic figure in the history of American baseball. You may perhaps also recall his angst in the Kevin Costner classic film, Field of Dreams, in which the protagonist played by Costner, hears voices, and as a result he plows under his field of corn and builds a baseball stadium on his farm in Iowa, under the premise that if he builds it, they will come, and not knowing essentially who they are, he proceeds to plow under his corn and spend his money and come to the verge of bankruptcy. And who should show up to play baseball magically on his cornfield but Shoeless Joe Jackson of the Chicago White Sox. Now, historically, the game of baseball gets rolling into a professional setting back in the 1870s. You have to remember that at that point, America's just coming off the cusp of the Civil War. There are many, many fallen Americans on both sides of that long and bloody conflict. And a nation is trying to come together and trying to rebuild in the aftermath of that confrontation. And as a result, there probably is a need for distraction and entertainment. And in steps America's game, baseball. And the first professional league is formed in 1871. From it, two leagues eventually evolved that survived, the National and the American League. And the tradition is established that the most victorious in each of those two leagues is known as the winner of the pennant. And the two pennant winners then come together post-season to play each other for the ability to call themselves the world champions of American baseball, or just baseball, and thus the World Series is born. It's a best 4 out of 7 series, just like it is today, and they get rolling with traveling about the countryside, entertaining the American populace. The economics then is a bit different than it is today. First of all, the players were only paid based upon what came in the gate. There was no revenue sharing. There were not, for the most part, product endorsements or that sort of idea. And so players were not being able to participate in things like TV royalties that we have today. While the players were necessarily paid a reasonable amount of money, that does not by any means suggest that they were receiving what they would consider a fair share of the revenues from their labors, and essentially many of them felt like they were being underpaid. They also could not leave their team without the team giving permission, and so if they were playing for the White Sox, they couldn't go play for another team without getting permission. They were locked in with these clauses, reserve clauses in their contracts that essentially said that if they didn't play for that team, they couldn't play for any team. Now, over time, that method of pay evolved, and in 1918, for the first time, one of the leagues decided that perhaps a better way to pay the teams would be to just have a flat rate pay scale. And that meant essentially that no matter how much money came in at the gate, that the owners of the team would nonetheless still get to keep the greatest measure of the revenue, and that would again mean that the players are not participating, and some of them are bound and obviously appropriately to the conclusion that that this was not equitable or fair. Really troubling about the idea of this flat pay scale is that that some of the players would receive less money than they had received before this plan, and so as baseball is gaining popularity, these players are being told not only are they not going to participate more, but they're going to participate less. And many think that this 1918 economic change, this pay scale of reduction, this lack of optimism regarding the future of the pay process may have led to the situation 1 year later in 1919 that really brings the situation in baseball to a head. In 1919, the White Sox were tagged to play in the World Series, and they were going to have the opportunity to play the Cincinnati Reds, and of course folks would be gambling on those games. Now, there are those who think that the gambling scandal of 1919 was when baseball lost its innocence. But there's an awful lot of scholarship out there that suggests that even before 1919 there was a fair amount of gambling and poor behavior going on in the world of baseball. Keep in mind, baseball was an in-person occupation and entertainment in the early days. It wasn't until August of 1921 that the first baseball game in America was broadcast by radio, so that those outside the stadium might enjoy it. And that, by chance, was a game between the Pittsburgh Pirates and the Philadelphia Phillies. But in the days we're talking about, 1918 and 19, these are really in-person entertainment venues. Now, what happens is that in October of 1919, the White Sox lose to the Cincinnati Reds in a game in which they had been heavily favored. There was suspicion that they had thrown the game, and thus a conspiracy was alleged. And it was later found in the investigation that the gamblers involved had paid 8 of the White Sox players to play just a little bit below their abilities or their standards and to throw the game. In that manner, the gamblers got good odds to make what were viewed as long shot bets in favor of the Cincinnati Reds. And then when the Cincinnati Reds prevailed, of course, those payoffs to the gamblers were significant. Now, what was paid? One player was paid $10,000. Another was promised 20, but actually paid only 5. And the news reports, the history reports note that $5,000 was about what a player made in professional baseball back in 1919. And that doesn't seem like a lot of money, but it was decent money at the time. Certainly not on par with the kind of money that professional athletes make in today's world. But there are those who would suggest to you that the marketing aspect, the celebrity aspect, the television broadcast aspect, that all of those things make a big difference in terms of the volume of revenue that is attracted by baseball today versus the volume of revenue then. So multiple players got more than $5,000 from these gamblers. All of them were suspended by the White Sox, and none of them, though, were officially ineligible to be put in baseball's Hall of Fame, at least not at the time. The news was big around the world of baseball, and they were suspended by their team. They made the headlines, and the headlines are not just in New York. The headlines are all over the country. And there's a great deal of controversy in terms of this being America's game and this being America's pastime, and that these folks have soiled it, and thus the tendency to say that baseball lost its innocence at that time. But really, there's good evidence that gambling had happened before. Perhaps not with this intensity, perhaps not as brazenly as here, but still there's evidence that it was not new to the game in 1919. So all 8 of the Black Sox players are indicted. They all have criminal charges brought against them, and there's a trial that's going to happen. In the midst of that, the players have been suspended by the team, and so in a broader context, there's a great public perception or public relations issue that baseball feels like it needs to address and needs to discuss. And so the decision is made that what baseball needs maybe is a commissioner. So in 1920, the owners offered Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the federal judge in Illinois, the position as the first commissioner of American baseball. And while Judge Landis accepted that position, he did not resign from the bench, and instead, for some period of time, served concurrently both as a federal judge, drawing a federal salary rather, and serving as the commissioner of baseball and drawing a significantly higher salary from a private organization. Engraved upon all of that is also the fact that as commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis is out in front of the press, out in front of this developing issue, and he is the face of American baseball. So the next year, responding to Judge Landis's involvement, the American Bar Association takes issue with his participation in this way. They label it a conflict of interest, and they vote to take some sort of action. They believe that they, as an organization, should step forward in some way and be a part of a solution to what they see as a significant problem vis-a-vis this judge being involved in American baseball in this manner. Now, that same year, the jury acquits the Black Sox. They've been suspended by their team, but the jury acquits them. And there are cheers in the streets, and there are headlines that are celebratory in nature. But it's a reprieve. It's not the end of the story. In the law, we often heard talked about the idea of jury nullification, where a jury, because of their affinity for or sympathy for an accused, they may elect in some settings not to strictly follow the law and to essentially decide that someone will go free, despite the fact that there may or may not have been evidence regarding why that person should not have gone free. But jury nullification is a subject for another day. So the day after the acquittal, Commissioner Landis rules that the players, the 8 players, will be banned from for life from baseball. And this, of course, doesn't mean they can't play baseball, but it means they can't play professional baseball. Now, neither Commissioner Landis or anyone else until much later gets involved in the Hall of Fame discussion, but the fact is that these individuals are pushed to the side of their chosen profession or occupation, and they're not going to be a part of it thereafter for some significant time. Because of the press coverage, because of the public relations, Commissioner Landis is one that goes publicly, and he says baseball is entirely competent to protect itself against crooks, both inside and outside of the game. He's making a strong positive comment that baseball is not going to be constrained by the criminal legal system or the decision of a jury. And despite the acquittal of the team members that were accused, baseball is nonetheless going to maintain its posture of not allowing these individuals to play. That is, the baseball is going to take things more seriously, I guess, than the court system did. Only the next year, after having served concurrently as judge and commissioner for 2 years, does Commissioner Landis resign from the bench. So, having made the decisions about banning the players from baseball, having been the public face of this organization while simultaneously being a judge, he eventually concludes that it's best for him to get out of one or the other, and he decides that he would rather have the payroll and the responsibility of being the commissioner. Now, that may have been based upon the criticism of the American Bar Association. It may have been based upon, in part, its obligation to the sanctity of the legal profession and the judiciary. That criticism may have come from a good place, in other words, and the ABA may have been making rational and reasoned statements regarding why this was inappropriate. But it lacked a foundation for those statements, those conclusions. It lacked it because there was no code of conduct for judges. And so in 1924, the American Bar Association decided that it would endeavor to draft standards which it elected to call the Canons of Judicial Ethics. And they reached out and tapped as their committee chair for this project the former President of the United States and the then current Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, William Howard Taft. I think that should be some indicia of how important those at the American Bar Association and those in the American legal system took this. This is the only U.S. President to subsequently serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, and as Chief Justice, no less. This is an imposing figure from America's public view. He is well known. He is often pictured in newspapers, and he's being put in charge of this project. I would suggest he brings to it a significant amount of gravitas or imprimatur, and I think that illustrates how important the Bar Association saw this. Now, let's think for a minute about what the Bar Association is. The American Bar Association primarily and fundamentally is voluntary. A great many American lawyers do belong to it, about 400,000 the last time I looked. But there's about 1.3 million lawyers in the United States total. And so the American Bar Association is made up of perhaps a third of the lawyers in the country. It is the most broad-based, the most systemic organization to represent American lawyers, and that is an important notation or important item of history to remember. But it is voluntary. It has no enforcement authority. It cannot tell lawyers what to do or what not to do. So what it had done back in 1908 is it had adopted a set of canons of ethics for lawyers. And the idea was that it would send the canons for legal ethics out to the states, and it was hoped that the states would adopt and give regulatory effect to those canons, to those rules. And it had done that in 1908, and that was working reasonably well. And so in 1924, that is the model that the committee of the ABA looked at, and it decided to create a set of model canons of judicial conduct or judicial ethics for similar proposal or recommendation to the various states. So as a result, we come up with 34 canons, each canon being a paragraph or perhaps several, each canon addressing a specific topic, and those topics are set forth in both the way judges should operate, things like avoiding impropriety, things like their obligations, things like working hard, being prompt, things like being courteous and civil to those who come to the court. There's also focus on things like independence and influence, the idea of having an independent judiciary. There are focuses here for the first time on things like ex parte communications, another level of professionalism for judges, and also the involvement of judges in community activities, in soliciting for charity, in participating in a wide variety of different things. Now, these canons are published, and they're not widely accepted as being effective or useful. Critics explained that they were too vague. They were nothing more than a wish list, unattainable goals, an ineffective set of pathway markers. Lots and lots of criticism about what they were and how they might operate or fail to operate in this environment that's being challenged. Despite that, for 46 years, the pessimists were somewhat surprised, probably, by the fact that the 1924 canons survived and were in use for 46 fairly uneventful years. It's important to know that the ABA Standing Committee was available throughout that 46 years, and part of their role was to interpret the canons and to issue advisory opinions about what their committee members thought that the canons might or might not mean, what activity might or might not be appropriate. 46 years. Now, in that 46 years, only 277 such formal opinions were ever written. And if you do that math, that comes out to about 6 each year on average. And so the pessimists that saw this set of canons as being too vague, as being unworkable, might reconsider, at least to some extent, in light of the fact that they weren't ineffective. They may not have been perfect, but they functioned within the realm and the scope for which they were designed for almost 50 years. And while that's not necessarily an endorsement of the ease of use, it is a compliment, perhaps, to those who did the drafting and put these together. Now, the perceptions and interpretations of the canon, that led to the readdressing of this concept in 1969, that 46 years later. The canons of professional ethics at that point are replaced by a model code of professional conduct. The model code is for the reduction of those various canons down into a more usable and more functional set of documents. And while that began in 1969 as regards lawyers, and thus the discussion began of doing something different for judges, it's not until 1970 that the committee comes back to actually drafting a code of judicial conduct change for judges. And so that begins in 1970 and is eventually adopted in 1972. So almost 50 years after those original canons. Now, what we got in 1972 was a much different product. The 1972 version is set out more in broad brush strokes, with the canons set forth only being main headers, the Roman numerals, and under them there being sections where things are explained better. There are some who see similarity between the original organization of the code and those broad brushstroke, multifaceted ideas of the canons, original canons from 1924, being broken up as subparts of these major headings in the new Code of Professional Responsibility, or the Code of Judicial Conduct. The code consists of norms. Norms are ideas about the way things should be. There are 5 of them, 5 canons, and they reflect aspirational language, perhaps is the best way to put it, of the way we believe judges should be. And so aspirational and inspirational at the same time, they offer an overarching view of what is important and why. And then in the sections that follow each of the canons, specific conduct is spelled out, and it is explained why certain things should be done, certain things are encouraged to be done, and certain things are forbidden. And it's supposed to be in a simpler form and a methodology in a manner that hopefully makes it easier for those who would study it to understand where and how things are going to be. Now, Canon 1 is about the independence of the judiciary, and it sets forth that a judge has to be independent and impartial. The need for impartiality and non-bias in judicial proceeding is the foundational core of judicial independence. And so this canon is sort of a catch-all, and it holds essentially that judges should participate in maintaining and enforcing high standards of conduct. That is, they should be involved in both the formation of this type of a code, and they should individually observe the standards that are set. Canon 2 is about avoiding impropriety and, more troubling, more difficult, the appearance of impropriety in all of a judge's activities. Canon 2 broadly prohibits conduct that could impair or even appear to impair judicial impartiality or independence. The judge has to comply with the law and avoid favoritism. The judge cannot be a member of an organization that participates in invidious discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, national origin. A judge can't be a member of an organization where her or his membership or presence might be served as a fundraising opportunity or in some way to impose an obligation or suggestion upon other members of the public that they should or must contribute in some way. We'll come back to the appearance issue in just a moment, but Canon 3 is about impartiality and diligence. It contains rules regarding the judge's official capacity. It is the most comprehensive and the longest. It addresses the duties in general, but it talks about the responsibilities, the disciplinary responsibilities, the supervision responsibilities, and it talks about when and how a judge would be disqualified from hearing a case. Disqualification gives an awful lot of judges a difficult time. Disqualification really comes in 2 descriptions, and the verbiage that attaches is worth noting because it's important. If a judge removes her or himself from a case on their own initiative and prerogative, that is referred to as a recusal. A disqualification comes at the motion of one of the parties. One of the parties is asserting that a certain judge should not be on a case, and if the judge agrees with that, then a disqualification is granted. It's important for us to remember the distinction between disqualification and recusal, because the recusal is at the judge's behest. That becomes important across the country in many jurisdictions, because in many jurisdictions the disqualification of a judge may be defined in a state law to be required as a matter of course. We call these one-strike states. California is one of them. And if a recusal or disqualification rather is requested of a judge, the judge has to look at the 4 corners of that request in California and probably has to grant it. Now, after that first disqualification has been granted, The second judge on a case is not nearly as obligated in most instances to grant the disqualification, first of all, or two, to limit themselves to what's in the four corners of the pleadings. In other words, on a second disqualification, the judge has the opportunity perhaps to speak to the veracity of the allegations made in the motion requesting the disqualification. That can become an important distinction in a situation where one individual is requesting serial disqualifications and disrupting thereby the flow and the path of the litigation and slowing the process for everyone involved, perhaps to a snail's pace, as new judge after new judge takes the reins and tries to come up to speed and be ready to hear that particular litigation. Canon 4, all about judicial extracurricular activities, things that a judge does outside of the classroom. Now, we know that a judge can't be involved in fundraising, but on the idea of an appearance of impropriety, here's a good example. Imagine a judge has a child that goes to the local high school. The local high school imposes an obligation on every parent to spend a certain number of hours each season donating time to the betterment of that athletic program. And this involves selling tickets at the gate to a stadium or to a gymnasium. This involves taking cash from people or cooking hamburgers in a refreshment stand at the event. This could involve an entire spectrum of things. And now, knowing that judges can't participate in fundraising, a parent who is a judge presented with that set of facts asked a simple question years ago: in what way might she or he participate and satisfy this family obligation to the child's extracurricular involvement? And the court spelled out essentially that there's nothing wrong with a parent volunteering at an event that involves fundraising, but can't be about the fundraising. The judge can't be the person in the concession stand that's shouting out to passers-by and encouraging them to buy a hamburger. But the judge can be the person that goes to the store in the middle of the afternoon before that game and does the purchasing so that hamburgers can be produced and sold. The judge can be the individual that takes the garbage out of the kitchen while those hamburgers are being prepared and served. The judge can be the person that stays after the event and cleans the kitchen to get it back to status quo after all those hamburgers were sold. In the same manner, there's an opinion that regards a relay race. And while a judge can't be involved in fundraising, there's no reason that a judge can't go and run in a race or walk in a 5K race that is, on one side of things, raising money, but on the other side of things is also an opportunity for people in the community to get out and get some exercise and be involved and engaged. And so, as long as the judge isn't soliciting contributions, as long as the judge isn't soliciting other runners or walkers to sign up, then the court's been fairly clear that the judge can go simply as a participant and participate even though an element of the day is admittedly fundraising in nature. In the minimizing conflict of interest, we have to remember here again the overriding, overarching mention of appearance of impropriety in Canon 2. The appearance of impropriety may be as important as the impropriety itself. And thus the judge, as regards those volunteering efforts and opportunities in the community, must be focused on not being seen as engaged in or perceived as being engaged in the actual fundraising activity. So the judge can certainly be the one that drives the bell ringer kettle to the store on a Sunday in the holiday season, but the judge can't be the one to stand next to it ringing the bell and seeking donations. So judges can contribute, and they should, We're all part of the community. But they can't be engaged and involved in a way that would be inappropriate. Now, beyond Canon 4 is Canon 5. Canon 5 prescribes activity and sets forth rules for individuals who are not judges but who hope to be. And time and again, this has come up in the appointment process in the OJCC. If someone has every intention of applying for a judicial position, but there are none vacant, then maybe a period of years goes by after this judge candidate or judge applicant has told all of her or his friends and family that they have every intention of applying for the next vacancy, it still doesn't make them a judge. But once somebody crosses the line and becomes a candidate, and arguably that means when you fill out an application for a gubernatorial appointment to the bench, that you have to refrain from inappropriate judicial political activity. And this can mean a whole variety of things. Making promises about the way cases will come out, participating in fundraising in certain issues and problems, not a blanket prevention, but a limitation nonetheless. And really the whole idea of defining action and appropriate action becomes a difficult aspect of one's existence from the day that they declare that they're going to in fact be a candidate. Now, various states have adopted the 1972 code. Since then, it has been amended various times and new proposals have been made. 35 states have adopted a revised code sometime after 1972. 10 states are currently working on whether to adopt the latest canons, the latest code. And one state, Mississippi in the middle there, has decided to do some interim changes while it waits on a decision from its elected representatives as to whether to get into the business of a new or amended code, revised code. Notably, Florida is down there in the bottom group. Florida, Alabama, Michigan, Virginia, and Wisconsin have not moved forward with substantive revisions in a great many years. There are those that think that that is an issue, and they think that the process should be engaged more often. Others are not so worried about it, and they believe that our code as it currently exists is sufficient for what it was designed to do, and is sufficient for keeping the various judges in a posture or process that is reasonably consistent with what their neighbor is doing, and has them issuing orders in a way that folks obviously will have to become accustomed to or used to, but the fact is that there's nothing to indicate that they cannot be accustomed or ready for those various changes. It's just a matter of getting in the mindset that those changes are going to come and going to happen. Where are these distinctions? Where are these revisions? A good example of that is the organization, the Boy Scouts of America. The Florida Code of Judicial Conduct presents no obstacle to a judge participating as a leader with the Boy Scouts of America. In fact, no code does any longer, but for a period of time before the Boy Scouts changed their operating process, they openly had a policy that precluded homosexuality in the Boy Scouts. And that's not a fair way to put it. It precluded openly homosexual members and leaders from participating. That has since changed, but a variety of states, California notably amongst them, had amended its code subsequent to 1972 to change its description of discrimination. It had both gender and gender identity listed in its code as the forms of invidious discrimination. And thus a judge sitting in California in the days when the Boy Scouts patently discriminated against those of various gender identity proclivities or universes, those judges in California could not participate with that organization. That illustrates a couple of things. Number one, the Code of Judicial Conduct is evolving over time. Things are changing. Two, though it is a national effort led by the American Bar Association, and though that organization has a preponderance of members in this group, the fact is that agreement is not always reached. And so even though the American Bar Association proposes a change vis-a-vis the invidious discrimination, that does not mean that every state in the union will follow through with or change its own powering and operating processes as regards that organization or as regards some point of view. So in the end, what we have is a reasonably simple, yet sometimes confusing, Code of Judicial Conduct. It is applicable because states' judicial systems have adopted it through their Supreme Court, or their legislatures have mandated it through legislation, or some executive somewhere has adopted it vis-a-vis certain adjudicators or employees as a standard, as a foundation. Another great lesson is that just because something is drafted, just because a rule exists, does not mean that it is immutable or forever. The simple fact of the matter is that rules get changed, and they get changed all the time. And it's entirely possible that the Code of Judicial Conduct will look different in 2 years than it looks today. But I will warn you that it may not change at the pace, it may not change with the frequency, and it may not change with the uniformity that some might hope for or strive for. The changes may never be revolutionary in terms of our Code of Judicial Conduct, but rather evolutionary, and it may take years at times to make amendments that are beneficial to the communities that we serve and to the system that we're a part of. It's my hope that this brief history of the evolution of the Code of Judicial Conduct is both entertaining and helpful. As always, and should you have any questions regarding this video or the perceptions expressed thereon, you can reach me through the email address at the bottom of this slide. Thank you for attending.